Hey, this is Jane Hughes, and you are listening to the Chill Parent Podcast, Episode 7.
To become a chilled parent that has time for yourself, feels fulfilled and full of energy, can still pursue your personal goals as well as being a present parent with a great relationship with your kids, there are 5 skills you need to master. In this podcast, I take you through each one and share with you information, tips, and real-life stories about how we can implement these in our daily lives as working parents, so you can finally step into the joy of parenthood without losing yourself.
Hello everybody. Okay, last week we talked about thoughts and beliefs that we might need to challenge in order to help you create more time and space for yourself. This episode, I'm going to be looking at things that are a little bit more practical. So what can you actually do to create that time, or what boundaries might you need to set in particular? So we're really going to be focused on setting boundaries today, okay? We're firstly going to look at how to identify where you may need more boundaries, like how do you know if you need a boundary or not? And then we're going to look at how do we set them properly, because that's actually something that I see a lot of people do wrong. They think they're setting a boundary and really they're not. And of course, we'll dive into some sort of personal things to help you relate to this and to help you kind of see how it's more applicable for you in your own life. So firstly, what I want to talk about is what actually is a boundary, because I think that's kind of a buzzword at the minute. We see it or hear it thrown around social media a lot. You know, you need more boundaries, you need boundaries with yourself, you need boundaries with others. But what actually is a boundary? Because I think that this confuses people a little bit. A boundary is where you intentionally demonstrate or show how you are willing to be treated and what you are or are not willing to put up with, okay? And you can have a boundary with yourself and you can have it with others. But it's where you are demonstrating how you will be treated to other people. I'm going to talk about that more in a second, but just bear that in mind. You're showing them, okay? How do you know if you need a boundary? Well, you have to really tune in to how you are feeling in order to identify where you need more boundaries. And the biggest indicator that I see is resentment. So when you start to feel a lot of resentment, I think that's normally a bit of a flag that you need to set better boundaries, either with yourself or someone else. I'll give you an example, okay? This is an example from my own life a few years ago when I was still teaching. And I started to have a lot of resentment about emails coming through on the weekends or outside of work hours. I wanted to use this example because I think it's a really common one for working mothers, especially after COVID. This just seems to be a lot more prevalent, where people just expect you to be online all the time, even when you're at home. And I think people do feel a lot of resentment towards that. Like, why should I have to answer emails or do work when I'm at home, when I'm trying to be with my family? So for me, I started to get a lot of resentment over that. You know, I would have other teachers emailing me, I would have students emailing me, and I would have parents emailing me outside of work hours, and it started to really piss me off. But then I kind of realized I'm answering them. I'm actually responding to these emails, and that's why they're contacting me. So I was like, well, if I don't respond to them, then they won't. So I deleted the emails from my phone, because I had the app on my phone, which I know a lot of you do with work. So delete it from your phone. There's nobody that says you have to have your emails. Like, unless you have something particularly specific written into your contract where you have to be reachable at home. For example, I work with some health providers and they are on call at certain times. But again, it's within those set time periods. Like, they know when they're on call, they have to be reachable at home. But when they're not on call, they don't have to be. So get really clear with what is and what is not expected from you at work in terms of what's in your contract. And then decide, when are you willing to be contactable and when are you not outside of that time. And then set that boundary. So you can communicate that to people, but then you also have to show it yourself. Because if I had just said to my students, I'm not going to answer emails outside of work anymore, but then they continued to email me and I continued to answer, that communication means nothing. And I can't be angry at them for that, because it's not their job to look after my feelings. It's my job to look after my feelings. It's just kind of human nature to try and get what you need in a situation. And a lot of people are going to try and get what they need from you whether that's at work, whether that's at home. And so it's your job to look after what you need, not theirs, because they're looking after themselves, you're looking after you. And I know that that might seem selfish to some of you, but at the end of the day, as I said in the last episode, you're better able to do your job and be there for them and look after them in a better way. Like I was a better teacher when I wasn't spending time outside of work working. I was much more present with the kids in the classroom. I was much more able to deal with, like, any teachers out there will understand this, like the crazy bombardment of stuff that you have to do throughout the day. Don't feel selfish for doing that, because you're better able to show up for other people in the world when you look after your own emotions, okay? So point being, with that example, if I had not deleted the emails off my phone, and if I had not stopped responding to emails outside of work hours, they would have continued to do it. But what happened was, when I stopped, they also stopped. They learned very quickly that, okay, Miss Jane does not respond to emails outside of work hours, so we'll just wait and we'll speak to her tomorrow. I'm guessing that you also know people like this, either that you work with, or it might even be in personal relationships. Like, I have friends who I know, after about 7 o'clock in the evening, they don't look at their phones. And so I don't message them anymore, because I know that they won't respond, and they don't look at their phone at night. I will wait until the next day. So that's because they have demonstrated to me how they want to be treated. And then I respect that, because what would be the point in me texting them if they're not going to text back? And it's the same with those work emails, okay? And I know some of you might worry, like, well, what if something important happens and people can't reach me? Won't I get into trouble? No, what I found is that if something important did happen and a message did need to be gotten to me over the weekend or at work hours, they would find a different way to contact me. Like, they wouldn't email me, they would ring me. There's always other ways of people contacting you if you're not contactable via email. So that's like quite a specific example, but the reason that I share that one is because of the resentment that came up at those times when I was outside of work and I was getting messages, and that resentment was a big indicator to me that I need a boundary in place, okay? So resentment is a big feeling to look out for. I want you to just have a think about areas of your life, like, where am I feeling resentment and what boundary am I lacking in that place? Back to what I said at the start, a boundary is about you demonstrating and showing other people how you want to be treated, because I often see people think they've set boundaries, but they don't actually do it correctly. So if I had said to them, don't email me outside of work hours, and then I'd continue to respond, that's not setting a boundary. That's making them responsible for my feelings. I'm trying to get them to change my emotions. They're not responsible for that. And they have their own emotions going on, as does everybody else in the world. Everyone else is trying to figure out their own stuff. They don't need to try and figure out yours as well. You have to look after you. So when you set a boundary, what you should be doing is you should be showing or demonstrating as well as communicating the way you want to be treated. Often I find people stop at the communication point. They'll communicate what they want, but they won't then show or demonstrate what they're going to do if that doesn't happen. Okay, so my demonstration was, if you do email me outside of work hours, then I just won't respond. That was the consequence. That was me demonstrating how I wanted to be treated, okay? And I see people do this with, like, partners, someone who's in, like, a particularly toxic relationship. They'll say, I don't want you to speak to me like that anymore. And then they think that that's them setting a boundary, and then they'll be like, I tried and they still speak to me like that. They didn't listen. And I'll say, well, what did you do about it? What did you do about it when they refused to listen to how you said you wanted to be treated? And often the answer is like, well, nothing. And that's not a boundary. Again, that's you making somebody else responsible for your emotions. You have to show them. You have to have that consequence, and you have to follow through with what you say you're going to do if they don't respect that. Like, if you're in a particularly toxic relationship and you say, if you do this to me again, I'm going to leave, you need to leave if they do it again. Because if you don't, you're showing them that your words don't really mean anything and they can treat you how they want to. Obviously, that's a little bit more of an extreme example, but you get what I'm trying to say. You're responsible for showing that person what you're going to do, okay? It's like with our kids. It's very, very similar to children. As a parent, you know, if you tell your kids that they can't have chocolate after dinner, and then they ask for it and you give them it, of course they're going to continue to ask for it. Of course they are, because they want the chocolate. And that's the same with other people in our lives. Like, obviously, you know, as people get older, they develop more empathy and they can have more understanding of this. But ultimately, humans are selfish in nature. So when we set a boundary with our children, we know that it's our job to show them that no matter how upset they are, no matter how much they kick and scream and fight against this boundary, we are not going to give them the thing that we've said that they can't have. And that's the boundary, okay? And that's what you have to do in your own life. You have to show people that no matter how they react to this, you are going to be firm in setting how you want to be treated, okay? So you have to think about the consequence at the end of it. And then there is mindset work that goes into holding boundaries. It might bring up guilt and discomfort. I'll talk about that more in a second. But that's a lot of what the last episode was about, like really managing your mind and challenging some of the thoughts that come up when you set these boundaries. So with that being said, let's dive into another example that I think that you can all relate to. And that is sharing the mental load with my husband. The mental load. It's a biggie. It's a biggie for us working women, okay? When we first had kids, I, as many of us do as women, naturally gravitated into doing a lot of the jobs around the house, like organising doctor's appointments, food prep, planning, childcare coordination. The list goes on, and you know exactly what I'm talking about if you're listening to this podcast. I know that you all get it, okay? But at the time, I was also doing the exact same job as my husband. I was also a full-time teacher. We were both full-time teachers. So I started to get a lot of resentment towards this. Like, I'm doing the exact same job as you, but I also have all this other stuff at home that seems to just be my responsibility. And I got really pissed off about it and I had a lot of resentment. And then I was like, okay, so there are some boundaries that need to be put in place here. I say it as if like this was something that we had chosen, but we hadn't. I just kind of naturally gone into these things because as a mother, I think that you do often kind of slip into these behaviors while you're on maternity leave. Like you're more often the one who is at home for the longest when you first have a child. And therefore you start to organise the doctor's checkups and thinking about what they're eating and what their nap schedule is. Like that just naturally happens when you're on maternity leave. And then when you go back to work, there very often isn't a conversation where you sit down and say, okay, we're both about to go back to work. Here's all this stuff I've been doing, which we now need to share out. We don't often have those conversations, and those conversations are needed, okay? So I had not discussed with my husband or set expectations about all the stuff I'd been doing because I didn't know I wanted it all shared out as well, right? It's hard to know. We haven't been in that situation before. So I think we need to have a lot of compassion, empathy, and understanding for ourselves and for our partners in these situations. Because of course, when he was working and I was off, of course it makes sense that I'm going to do those things. But then once those things are being handled, he's no longer thinking about them anymore. So when we both go back to work, it's just not something that is on his mind because he's never had to think about it. What I do want to say is this goes a lot deeper into kind of like the way society is structured now and particular messages and programming that we've received as women growing up and that men have received. And it's about sort of unraveling all of that and looking at where we are now and what we want now. And it involves a little bit of deeper work. What it came down to essentially was that there was two boundaries that I needed to put into place. One was with myself. I was doing all of this stuff and working full time and looking after everyone and everything and not making any time for myself. And that was my responsibility. I should have been making time for myself and I wasn't. So I needed better boundaries with myself and my own time. I also needed better boundaries with him. We needed to sit down and we needed to talk about these things and we needed to have boundaries in place. Like, this is my role, that's your role. I'm not going to be involved in that anymore. And this sounds really simple to do. Well, just make more time for yourself and share out the load better. Now, everybody listening to this podcast knows that that sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult to do for various reasons. There's a lot of mindset work that goes into making those two changes because you're navigating new standards in your relationships, as well as breaking down sort of gender roles and stereotypes that may have been ingrained in you growing up. You as a woman are asking for help and support, which you may not be used to doing. A lot of us find that difficult to do when we've always been someone who's just had their shit handled all the time. You are going to have to put yourself above others in a lot of situations in order to make sure that you have time for yourself now, which can feel really difficult and can bring up a lot of discomfort, as I mentioned in the last episode. If you haven't listened to that, go back and listen because this will make a lot more sense. there's a lot of stuff to unravel behind these two changes. So although these two boundaries feel or sound very simple to put into place, they can be very difficult. Okay, so I thought that it would be a good thing to talk about how I've kind of progressed in this area, how I've helped clients progress in this area in this episode, because I think it is a lot harder than it sounds. I'll go back to what I said before in what does it look like when we actually set that boundary properly? Because again, I was somebody who did this too. I would say to my husband, like, I want you to take more control over this thing. Can you just take that off my plate? And he'd be like, yeah, okay. And he'd remember for a little while and then he'd forget. But then I would do it. So I wasn't setting that boundary properly because I was jumping in and taking that responsibility back from him. Okay, so I wasn't holding the boundary. So you need to be comfortable with allowing the consequences if it's not done, or if it's not done the way that you want it to be, even if that's difficult for you at first, okay? And it will be difficult. So what you need to think about, a question you need to ask yourself when you sit down and you have these conversations with your partner and you try to share out the mental load a little bit more, you need to think, what is more important to me with this particular role? Is it more important to me that this job gets done exactly how I want it to be done? Or is it more important that it's taken off my plate? Now, there's no right or wrong answer to that. Before you do this, you need to set awareness around that, because if it's more important to you that it's done exactly the way that you want, it's going to be very, very hard to hand control of that over to your partner. So get really clear first about which jobs you want to keep and which you want to pass on, okay? And this is something that I am telling you because it's something that I didn't do. I would try and get my husband to take responsibility for things, and then I would jump in and do it because he wasn't doing it the way that I wanted, or he wasn't doing it quick enough. And that would create even more resentment. And my own coach at the time, went through my own journey with this. She was like, you're not willing to wait for him to figure this out. Like, if you give a job to someone at work, like if it's a new role or something, or you're expecting a kid to learn how to do something new, you don't expect them just to immediately be able to do it to the same standard that someone else who's been doing it for years can do. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And she was like, but you're not willing to give your husband that space, that transition period, that time to kind of figure out how to do it and to do it efficiently. And I was like, yeah, she's right. I'm not, I'm being impatient. And I see that with a lot of women, that we've just been doing these things for a long time. This transition period where you decide what roles you want to get rid of, you sit down and you have a conversation and you hand those over to your partner, but then you need to allow that transition period where they have to figure it out. They have to learn how to do it. They have to figure out how to do it and how to do it efficiently. And when they're figuring that out, they might make some mistakes that may impact everybody, which is difficult, okay? But if you truly want this off your plate, you have to allow that transition period. You have to allow that, and it can be uncomfortable. But you have to hold that boundary, as I said, okay? You have to demonstrate that you are no longer taking responsibility for this. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be a bit of a bitch about it and be like, I'm never, ever going to help you with this ever again. I can talk about that in a second. But you have to allow the kind of difficulties that they may face and that kind of transition period, okay? So if what I'm saying kind of resonates with you, what advice I would give you from conversations I've had myself, and this is not something that we have totally figured out yet, okay? Like, I'm a big believer that just because I'm a coach doesn't mean that I have like a perfect life and I have all this crap figured out. The big part of what makes me so good at what I do with other people is that like I'm experiencing it myself all the time, working through it myself, figuring it out. So this is not something that we have got down to a T yet. This is something that we still work on as a couple as new things come up. One of the things that I have thought has been helpful is this conversation around make a list of everything that needs to get done in your household, okay? And when you make that list, there are a few things that you need to put on it, not just the actual task itself. You need to also include the planning of the task. So There are things like anticipating the need, like you're anticipating that in 3 months' time, so-and-so is going to need their doctor's checkup or their vaccine or, whatever it is that they're going to need, like maybe a birthday party. You're anticipating that need, so you're thinking about it. And there might be something that you have to look at options. Like, for example, if it's a birthday party, you might need to figure out what your child wants to do. What are the options that you have the budget for and things like that. So there's the planning phase, and you need to write that down when you write down all the stuff that goes into running the household. There's then the decisions phase. So you make the decision and you book, if there's a booking that's involved. And then there's the execution. Then there's the actual doing of the thing, okay? And what I think women are particularly good at is the planning phase, is the anticipating the needs phase. And so it might be that you're going to take more control of that, which I think women naturally do, but that your partner is going to take more control over the decisions and the booking and the execution of the tasks, okay? But, everybody's different. Like I said, that what I see is that in general, what I'm talking about is between women and men, but obviously there's like a whole spectrum of where you are in that. And you might find that your particular strength is different. It might be the opposite in your relationship. Like whatever it is, it doesn't matter. What's important is that you identify what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. You sit down and you talk about them together, and then you divide up the things that have to happen to run the household. You divide them up fairly, okay? Then, as I said before, like you're not just going to be like, okay, that's your job now, but goodbye, I'm not going to help you at all. You want to have a conversation around what kind of support you both need while you take on these new roles, while you go through this transition period. This might be something that you've been doing for a really long time, so you might have a certain set of knowledge or skills that really help you to do this that your partner is going to need, and you want to pass those on to them. You want to give them that knowledge, those skills. Like it might be like, if they're going to take responsibility for booking all the doctor's appointments, you might have a set of doctors, a particular doctor that you really like, or a kind of few different doctors that you go to and see and that you really like. And you might want to tell your partner who those are, why you like them, how to contact them, which doctor surgery they're at, whatever. You get the point, okay? You want to pass on that knowledge to make it easier for that person to do it, and to do it in a way that like you've been doing and you found that works. It helps them to do it, okay? But once you've had that conversation and once you've given each other that support, you then need to allow them to figure it out. And this is the difficult bit. That's the bit where you're going to be tempted to step in, and you're going to be tempted to express unhappiness that they haven't done it the way that you wanted it done, or they haven't done it right, or they've made a mistake which has impacted everybody. And if you're taking on a new role, that might happen for you too. And you have to give each other grace and compassion during this period. You have to manage your mind and allow that boundary to be there. You have to hold that boundary, okay? Remember, you're demonstrating that you are no longer going to be responsible for that. And if you jump in and do it, the boundary means nothing. The benefits of this are threefold. You free up a lot of time for yourself when you have these types of conversations and set these boundaries. You feel more supported, and you will have more headspace. So it might be a struggle at the start, but once you start to see those benefits, it's going to be much easier to hold that boundary, because you're going to experience the positive consequences of holding that boundary. It is sometimes good to have support when you do this. I had my own coach guide me through this process, and I'm still not all the way there. Like, I'm still tempted to jump in and control the way he does things sometimes. And I know that's not the best quality that I have. And I know it's in my best interests as well to not jump in, but it's difficult sometimes when you can see an easier way to do something. It's difficult. And yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only one that struggles with this, guys. Like, reach out, let me know, like, make me feel better, please. Okay, I want to give you an example with work now as well. Okay, so this is one that I set recently with a client. She manages a team, as I mentioned in the last episode. But those of you who are listening to this podcast, you care a lot about other people. You are often doing things for others. And she was the same in her role as a manager. And I often see this come up with my clients who are in managerial positions. They find it difficult because they are very concerned about how people are feeling, and they sometimes do take on a bit too much. So anyway, this particular client, she manages a team, and she often felt overwhelmed because there were just so many things to do. And she was also, thinking about the things that she had to do at home a lot as well. And she was often managing a lot of that herself. Her husband worked away. So she often felt kind of overwhelmed. And then that kind of came across, as I talked about in the last episode, it comes across as like unfocused when you are overwhelmed and you start to flip from task to task and you can't concentrate on one thing. You become overwhelmed and your productivity goes down and your performance suffers, okay? So she was starting to get resentful of people requesting meetings all the time, and then her never having time for herself to kind of just think about what needed to happen. So we discussed that there needed to be a boundary in there. She needed a boundary at work where she was going to give herself time. So what she started to do is she started to set, once a week she would have a meeting, it booked in her calendar with herself. So nobody could book a meeting with her at that time. That was a meeting for her to have with herself, where she kind of looked at the bigger picture of what was going on at work, anticipated everybody's needs, looked at what the intentions were for the week, where were the priorities, okay? She also then set a boundary daily, a daily block of time in her calendar where she would like have lunch and just create a bit of space for herself. Now, at the start, she said that felt a little bit difficult because people would request meetings and she could see that she had this time on her calendar where like she could probably get them in at that time if she wanted to, but she knew she needed to hold that boundary to become better at what she did. And she did hold that boundary. And then in a very short period of time, she started to experience how much more productive and how much more focused she was and how happier the team were because things were getting done because she was doing this. Her looking after herself and her own needs and honoring that improved the performance of the team as well as improved her own performance. So as a manager, that can be really important as well. If you think about it, as working mums, we're quite often like household managers, really, aren't we? When we're organising all this stuff. And so again, it comes back to like making sure that you prioritise your own time. You have those boundaries in place to create space and time for yourself so you can be better at what you do. And it was much easier for her to stick to that then. Once she kind of knew that how much it benefited herself and everybody else, it's so much easier for her to just keep that, to hold that boundary and to keep that space in her calendar for herself, okay? So it's 1,000% worth it just to get through that temporary uncomfortable stage where you're tempted to not hold the boundary. Stick with it, okay? And if you need to get support to hold those boundaries, reach out. Okay, so as I said, when you look after your own needs, you become a better parent, a better partner, a better worker, and you feel happier yourself. If I haven't sold the idea of creating space for yourself to you yet this month, I don't know what else to say. Go and create some space for yourself, okay? In summary of this episode, what I want to say is if you need boundaries, the first step is to identify where you need them. And remember, look out for resentment. That's a big red flag. Step 2 is to communicate them effectively with whoever's involved. If needed, there may not need to be any communication if it's just a boundary with yourself. You need to identify what you need to do to hold that boundary and think ahead of time, like what uncomfortable thoughts might come up that are going to prevent me from holding this boundary in place, and make a plan of action of how you're going to deal with them when they come up. As I said, last episode is going to be really helpful for you. If you haven't listened to that, go back and listen. And then step 4, managing your mind when you feel yourself wanting to break it. Getting some support around that if you need it, okay? All right. That is the end of this month that was dedicated to creating space. And as I said, if I haven't convinced you yet that this is something that you should be doing, then I just don't know what else to do. Next month, we're going to be talking about the next step in creating better work-life balance, which is knowing yourself. And it's quite a fun one. I'm excited to dig into that with you next episode. So anyway, have a lovely week. Create lots of space for yourself so you can be better at what you do and be a better parent. And I will speak to you next week. Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Chilled Parent Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about me and my work, then come visit me at www.livelongandlush.com. That's live, long, and the full word, lush.com. Or connect with me on my Instagram or Facebook at Jane Hughes Coaching. That's Jane with a Y, Hughes, Hughes. See you next time.